and welcome back. This is most likely the last One Piece related video that I am doing before Season 2 of the live action comes out. Also, this one might be a bit messy because I want to talk about many random things that I didn't get the chance to talk about in all of my previous videos. But before we begin, here's a quick mandatory summary about me. I've seen Season 1 of the show, then I've read the first 95 chapters of the manga, which is only the content already covered in Season 1, so that I could go into Season 2 blindly, and then I also did a Season 1 rewatch. Another quick reminder is, please don't leave any spoilers about future arcs in the comments without warning. Thank you. Today, my plan is to discuss the following topics. First, I want to do a final general review of the show and also a general final comparison of the East Blue Saga in the manga and in the show. So I guess I should also give a minor spoiler warning that if you've only seen the show, then I will also reference the manga and vice versa. But obviously, like I said, I know pretty much nothing about the future events. Next, and it's related to the first point, is that I want to discuss how the Straw Hats were adapted. Who, in my opinion, was the most true to the source material and who was done dirty. And if you've seen my manga reviews, then you all probably already know who exactly I'm talking about. Next, I'll discuss some of the changes that the live action made, and I will try to sort them out into good changes, bad changes, and messy changes, and I'll explain what that means later. Next, I want to talk about specifically my rewatch of Season 1 after having read the manga and point out some details that I find cool and that I missed on my first watch through. And the last thing on my plan is to touch upon some behind the scenes stuff that I watched, talk about some other general things, answer a few questions asked in the comments, and I also have a little bonus at the end that I want to share that I personally find really cool. So, without any more delays, let's begin. The first thing on my plan is doing a general final review of the show and also a general comparison between the live action and the manga. My opinion is a bit weird. I watched the show first and I absolutely loved it. From the very beginning, it became one of my favorite shows ever, and it's crazy that a single season was enough for that. Then I read the same arcs in the manga, and I thought that the manga was somehow even better. But instead of liking the live action any less, reading the manga did the opposite and gave me a newfound appreciation for the show. I feel like these two different versions of the same story really complement each other nicely, and you almost get the best experience specifically by consuming both. I also think that most of the changes in the One Piece live action don't come from specific writing decisions, but instead arise naturally due to the differences of the two mediums. For example, everything in the live action is toned down compared to the manga, like the character personalities or the world itself, but it makes sense. Real actors are not the same as 2D drawings on paper, and I think that even the biggest manga purists would feel off-put if real people acted the same way how characters on a page do. On the other hand, live action as a medium has its own strengths. For example, actors bring a lot of charm to their performances, a lot of charisma, a lot of emotion. I also loved the editing in many of the scenes, and I think that having those cuts within scenes or between scenes adds more punch that's difficult to achieve with just the paneling on a manga page alone. The action was amazing, the sets looked gorgeous, but I'll talk about these specific things in a later part of my video. And obviously, I adored the soundtrack of the live action. Some of my personal favorite examples include the track 100 Million Berry that played in episode 7 when Nezumi took Nami's money, and also Zoro's theme, mostly Wado Ichimonji, that played in episode 4 when Zoro was in the well. But regardless of my personal taste, the entire soundtrack was so well made and really complemented each scene. I also adore how every character, place, or character group had their own unique sound assigned to them. While it's common in shows and movies for the main characters and places to have their own themes, but usually they still have a common sound to them. One Piece went beyond that because not only every element in the show got a unique theme, but they also got a completely separate genre. And I also adore how some scenes mixed those sounds. For example, when Zoro fought Mihawk, we could hear both of their themes. We had these traditional sounds associated with Zoro mixing with flamenco music, and it worked so beautifully. It just added that little extra spice to that fight. The show's approach to the soundtrack really reminds me of Epic the Musical and the approach that the creator of that musical also took. That musical is also a wild mix of genres where different characters have one dominant instrument, so when those characters or their philosophies collide, their instruments and their themes also mix together. So One Piece soundtrack really reminded me of that musical. I am actually not good with music at all. I am more of a visual person, but even I put a lot of weight on soundtracks when I watch any show. It's such an underrated part of storytelling. When you have good soundtrack and good sound design in general, most times you don't even notice that, but it elevates every single scene to a completely new level. So yeah, in conclusion, I think that the One Piece soundtrack was very well made and complemented and elevated every single scene. My final general point is that I think everyone can agree that One Piece is not an easy story to adapt. In fact, if I had read the manga before the show came out, I would have said that adapting this story is impossible. And yet the team not only did it, but they did it incredibly successfully. And I think that the main reason for that is that everyone who worked on season 1 seems to be a genuine One Piece fan, from the showrunner to the actors. This show is clearly a result born from love and passion and not just for the money. And in hindsight, it actually makes sense. One Piece is the most popular manga in the world. I tried looking it up, and in terms of sales, One Piece is just as popular, if not more popular, than Harry Potter. It's just that manga volumes usually aren't included in the lists of best-selling books. And when you have an epic story like that and you decide to adapt it, you simply cannot fail. So it makes sense to bring in the original author, to get his stamp of approval on everything, to gather the best team possible, to give some serious budget to the project, and so on. Despite the fact that it's a Netflix show, and I don't have the highest opinion on Netflix, to put it mildly, but I still have full faith that season 2 and any following seasons won't disappoint, and there aren't many shows where I can say the same from any studio. And I know there was some changes with the showrunners, but I wouldn't be too worried. I doubt that the steering wheel of such a massive project would have easily been given to someone incompetent. Besides, season 1 was great and objectively successful, so the people in Netflix would have to be absolutely stupid to start pushing a different creative vision, something that's closer to the usual slop that Netflix creates. And maybe I'm too much of an optimist, I don't know, but at the moment I feel like the future of the One Piece live-action show is bright. But now, let's get a bit more specific. On my first watch, I really couldn't decide which episodes were my favorite. It felt like the show kept getting better and better with each new episode, but now I think it was mostly recency bias. After a rewatch, I feel like some episodes withstood the test of time better than the others, and especially reading the manga really changed my opinion on Nami's arc and everything with her village, and changed it for the worse. Now I think that the first 2 episodes and also everything that happened in Baratia were the best episodes, while the Syrup Village and the Kokoyashi Village stuff wasn't as exciting to watch the second time. I keep wondering what I would feel if I hadn't read the manga before a rewatch, because for example, with the Kokoyashi Village, everything in the show now feels like such a downgrade compared to the manga, but I have no way of knowing how I would feel without that additional point of reference. You can judge the show as an adaptation of the manga, or you can judge it as its own thing, like, oh hey, there's this new show about pirates, and depending on that, I think that the final rating changes. Please ignore the outfit change. Yes, this is a different day, but let's just move on. I want to discuss specific changes to the characters and the plot separately, but when it comes to more general things, I think that the most important part is that the show kept the soul of the manga. The world feels alive and magical and exciting, the main themes are still there, the characters, even if there were some changes, still bring that deep emotion from the source material, and I think that these things, the soul, the themes, the emotions, they are much more important than keeping the plot intact. On a semi-unrelated note, I recently did a review of the Percy Jackson TV adaptation Season 2 as a book reader, and while I wasn't the biggest fan of Season 1, I am not afraid to admit that, at least to me, personally, Season 2 felt better than the second book. That show changed the plot in very significant ways, yes, but Those changes allowed to focus on the characters and the main themes of that universe. So, going back to One Piece, I feel like the heart and the soul of the source material is in the show. And personally, I don't care if that means making changes to the plot. I actually believe it's the opposite. Even the people who read the manga first could still be surprised by how the events in the show played out. You end up with two different versions of the same story, and personally, I don't see a problem with that as long as both versions share the same core that made fans love that story in the first place. And also as long as both versions can function as their own strong, separate stories individually. I never understood those book purists who complain about the stupidest things, like, let's say, an actor having a different colored eyes or hair compared to their character's description in text. I genuinely want to ask those people, do you like the story because of what it gives you and how it improves your experience as a human being, or because the main character has a certain color eyes? Now, obviously, it's a little bit different with adapting manga. Manga isn't just a series of books. At the end of the day, manga is also a visual medium, so it's a little bit more important to capture the aesthetics of characters and the world. But my point still applies to making plot changes and even some visual changes. And the other small thing I want to mention is that it's great how the show creators have the luxury to pull things not just directly from the arcs they are currently adapting, but from entire manga that's released so far. It allows to do some early setups and sprinkle in some Easter eggs, which makes the final product better. But now it's time to talk about how the characters were adapted. In terms of accuracy, I think that the trophy goes to Mihawk. He feels like he was taken straight from the manga page and dropped into the show. But if I talked about every single character, this video would be 10 hours long, so I'll focus only on the Straw Hats. Out of the Straw Hats, the one who felt the closest to the manga, in my opinion, is Zoro. The only difference that I can think of is that he was a bigger troll in the manga. He was a bit goofier, like when he told Usopp's pirates that their captain had been eaten. But given that everything and everyone in the show was toned down, then I feel like Zoro's changes fit into that. I also think that the show kind of compensated for that by making Zoro unintentionally funny. For example, when he was asked in Kaya's mansion what he would wear and he replied something black, and then later Nami threw something at him, he looked at those clothes and said, like, dead serious, nice. The thing is that Zoro is very dramatic in both the manga and the show. The difference is that in the manga, everyone is dramatic, so Zoro doesn't exactly stand out. But in the show, everyone seems less dramatic compared to their manga counterparts, except Zoro. I feel like in the show, Zoro is just as dramatic as he is in the manga. For example, when he lost against Kuina, he was like, fine, just kill me. I don't deserve to live if I can't win. And I feel like it's specifically Zoro being very dramatic that creates that unintentional comedy, and therefore it makes Zoro's character in the show feels very close to his manga counterpart, who is a perfect mix between insanely cool and also very goofy and dramatic. The second Straw Hat, who in my opinion is very close to their manga counterpart, is Luffy. I feel like Iñaki Godoy, and I really hope that I'm not butchering his name, is literally the perfect actor to play Luffy. Luffy is such a unique character, and it's honestly a miracle that they even found someone to play him and play him very well. It's important to mention that I do believe that the show Luffy is just a little bit different than the manga Luffy, but both characters are great and work for the story that's being told. First, I feel like manga Luffy was a bit meaner. Don't get me wrong, he was still good and kind, but he was also brutally honest. And I feel like the best example is how he handled Kobe. In the show, Luffy encouraged Kobe from the very first second that they met. In the manga, however, when Kobe asked Luffy if he thought if Kobe could be a Marine, Luffy was like, "I don't know, you're kind of a wimp and gutless and weak." It was only after Kobe stood up for himself without being directly pushed by Luffy, it was only then that Luffy started encouraging Kobe too. I also feel like manga Luffy was a bit more of a rage baiter. I'm not even sure if I'm using the term correctly, but I hope you still understand what I'm trying to say. He was like this little evil gremlin in the source material. In the manga, he was constantly provoking everyone, while in the show, his mean comments feel much more sparse. They are still there, but in the manga it felt like Luffy was constantly destroying everyone around him verbally. I think that these changes that I pointed out are not critical. Yes, Luffy feels a little bit different, but he is still Luffy. The main core of that character is still there, and that's what I meant when I said that he's perfect. And besides, I think that toning down some aspects of his character is probably better for the live action. Next character is Sanji. With him, instead of talking about him through the lens of accuracy, I actually want to look at him through the lens of how he was changed and how he was handled in the show. Out of all the Straw Hats, Sanji is my personal favorite example of adapting the character from the manga to the live-action show. In both versions, he's insanely cool as Zoro, only in his own unique way. But he's also crazy about women. In the manga, he gets these hard eyes, he quite literally goes crazy, he probably fills in a certain manga trope that I'm not the biggest fan of. And this quality simply wouldn't work in the live action. It would come off as very creepy. It would have been so easy for the creators of the show to simply remove that quality altogether, because otherwise they risked creating a very hateable character. And I am so happy that they found a middle ground, a compromise, where this quality isn't removed, but instead it's modified to not feel so off-putting. Live-action Sanji is a hopeless flirt instead of being straight-up crazy about women, and it adds so much charm to his character. It adds a character flaw where he feels just a bit pathetic, but I'm saying that in the most loving and respectful way possible. I feel like I'm not articulating this well, But the bottom line is that I love how Sanji was adapted for the show, and if we look exclusively at the live action and ignore everything in the manga, then I feel like Sanji might even be my favorite at this point. But it's very difficult to compare the Straw Hats against each other when all of them are so different and unique and beautiful in their own way. But let's move on to Nami. In terms of characterizations, I feel like she's the least accurate to the source material, but that's not necessarily bad. One of the comments under one of my videos summarized it perfectly, but I unfortunately lost that comment, so I'll try to do my best to explain what that comment said that I wholeheartedly agree with. Nami, in both versions, experienced a lot of pain, but she dealt with that pain and hid it in different ways. In the manga, Nami refused to cry in front of the others. She was smiling a lot, she looked so cheerful, and that's how she hid her pain. In the live action, Nami wasn't even trying to pretend. Her demeanor carried this message that, yes, life sucks, just deal with it. Instead of smiles, she hid her pain behind a hard and harsh exterior. Both versions deliver the same point, only in different ways. So yeah, the comment went something like this. I also think it's important to consider the context, mainly Belmere's character and the village. In the manga, Belmere literally delivered this speech about how the girls should never lose their ability to laugh no matter what happens, and manga Nami really took that speech to heart. She faced the harsh reality with laughter, even if most times it was fake. The live action cut that part, so in a way, Nami just didn't have a reason to smile. She also wasn't totally alone in the manga compared to the show. The story in the manga was about the tragedy of the whole village and the whole situation, while the story in the live action was about the tragedy of Nami, and therefore Nami's character in the show was much more outwardly grim. When it comes to this specific change in characterization, I don't have a preference because I think that both versions are good, only in different ways. In the manga, Nami's smiles can now be real when they used to be fake, while in the show, now Nami can smile, while before she couldn't. But that's not the only difference. Another thing is Nami's dream to draw the map of the world. I feel like the show focused on that too little. In the manga, it felt like Luffy would have been the perfect person for Nami to join, regardless of the circumstances, while in the show, it felt like Nami joined the Straw Hats almost out of fondness and gratefulness, and her dream wasn't stated explicitly until the very end of the season. And the last thing about Nami is the fact that she's a thief, that she's greedy. In the manga, at least so far, it feels like an inherent part of her character, but the show made it seem like she only stole because she needed to, and now that she doesn't need to steal anymore, I'm not sure what the show will do with this aspect of her character in the future. Characters need to have flaws. They need to have some aspect of their character that actively gets them into trouble, and at the moment, all Straw Hats have those flaws except the live-action Nami. So, in conclusion about Nami, While I don't mind that her demeanor in the show was different, but now that specific chapter of her story is done, so I need the live action to show me who Nami is beyond the tragedy she survived. And finally, we get to Usopp. My boy was done so dirty. In the manga, he's my favorite character. In the show, on the other hand, he is far from that. And the funny thing is that Usopp's characterization in the show is actually perfectly fine. Usopp feels like Usopp, if that makes any sense. The problem is that the show removed so many moments that made Usopp shine in the manga. We didn't get his inner struggle in Arlong Park. He didn't get to do much in his own arc in Syrup Village. He joined the crew only after being pushed by everyone, while in the manga it was his own very active choice. We also didn't get the kids who added so much emotional depth to his character. And even his backstory in the live action was something that fell flat because in the show it was framed as something overly dramatic, while in the manga the main purpose of that backstory was to emphasize Usopp's deepest, most secret inner desire. So yeah, my hopes for season 2 is that we get to see more heroic moments for Usopp, where he is still terrified and shaking, but he actively decides to do what's right despite those fears. I also hope to see a more chaotic side of Usopp. In season 1 of the show, he was quite charming, but in the manga he also has this totally chaotic energy. For example, when he was hysterically hitting that one fishman with a hammer because he panicked when that fishman started getting up. So yeah, with Usopp, I feel like the foundation is there, his characterization is completely fine, but what I need is for the writing to focus on him more. And that's all I have to say about the characterizations of the Straw Hats. Now let's move on to specific plot changes. Obviously, it's impossible for me to talk about every single change, but I tried to make a list with changes that I personally thought were a bit more significant. I probably missed something, so please forgive me, but I tried to do my best. The first category I have is good changes. In other words, how the show, in my opinion, improved the manga. These are in no particular order, by the way. The first one is pushing Luffy's backstory to a later time. In the manga, Chapter 1 was Luffy's entire uninterrupted backstory, and I think it was a good change to start the show with the current-day Luffy. We meet this very peculiar boy who's clearly different than people around him, and it creates this little mystery for the viewers, like, how did he turn out this way? We get attached to the current-day Luffy before finding out more about him and about his past. I also love the structure of episode 2 in particular, where the past events were directly paralleled with the current-day events. Overall, I think that this change made the backstory more impactful, even if personally I think that the manga Shanks was a bit more fun character than the live-action Shanks. And while I'm on the topic of backstories, the same applies to Zoro's backstory. In the manga, we were shown his entire backstory in Chapter 5, which is almost immediately after meeting him. So I think it was good to push that story to a later time. And also I loved how, once again, it was directly tied to the emotional conflict of the current day Zoro. Another good change, in my opinion, is Nami's involvement in Shellstown. From the very beginning, she was established to be a capable and very interesting character, and she immediately felt like a main character with equal importance to the others. While in the manga, she was only introduced in Orange Town with the Buggy arc, and in the manga it took a bit of time for her character to start feeling more equal to the others. And since I already mentioned Buggy, I think it's great how the live action kept him for a longer time. Buggy is a very fun character, so it's great that we didn't have to say goodbye to him after Orange Town was finished. I also prefer how Buggy's power was kept a secret in the show, while in the manga we were straight up told, oh yeah, Buggy ate a devil fruit, even if at the time we didn't know what exact fruit. The same logic applies to the mystery surrounding Nami. In the manga, she reveals it pretty much immediately that she needs 100 million berry to buy a village, while in the show, it's kept secret until episode 7, which creates way more tension and mystery. The next change is making the fight against Kuro happen in Kaya's mansion. While in the manga, I loved many things about this fight that were, unfortunately, cut from the show, but overall I think that the mansion is a more interesting set to have this fight than the beach. It gave that episode some light horror elements, and the mansion itself was a very cool set, like how it could lock down, or all the different rooms, like the one where every surface was covered in plates, or the room just for clothes. That arc in the live action had a very unique and strong identity with the visuals and the mood that makes it stand out from the other episodes. I also adored Nami and Kaya's friendship and all the parallels with their stories, which simply wasn't a thing in the manga. I also think that Buchi and Sham were turned from the most forgettable characters in this arc in the manga to some of the most fun elements in this arc in the show. I also love how the show added Usopp's complicated feelings about his dad and Luffy hanging out while Usopp was abandoned. While overall I prefer how that reveal was done in the manga, but Usopp's feelings were more interesting in the show, in my opinion. While I'm still talking about the Syrup Village, I also love how the show gave it a more interesting world building compared to the manga. In the manga, it was just a few houses in a field, but the show made Syrup Village into a town famous for its shipmaking, which in itself is already more interesting, but it also had some additional positive impact, like explaining Kaya's family wealth, or how Usopp met Kaya because he was given a job at a shipyard. Next is Yosaku and Johnny. I'll be honest, while they had some fun moments in the manga, overall I think that the live action made a good decision by completely cutting them. In the manga, they mostly functioned as exposition machines, and the live action just found ways to introduce the information that we need in more natural ways. And the final tiny addition that the live action made that I love is that we got more scenes of the crew bonding, especially in Baratia. In the manga, majority of that arc was fighting, So I really appreciate those quiet and slower moments where our characters can just have dinner, tease each other, have some intimate conversations like we saw with Nami and Zoro when they played their drinking game, or how Luffy, after Zoro was injured, talked about being a captain and some other things with Sanji, Nami, and unconscious Zoro. But now let's move on to a second category, which is bad changes. The first one is Kobe. In the manga, he was a much more active character who stood up for himself after simply being inspired by Luffy, while in the show he had to be pushed and encouraged by Luffy directly. And it isn't just Kobe. The same goes for Usopp, who in the live action had to be convinced to join the Straw Hats because he was reluctant to leave, while in the manga it was his own very active choice, and he said how he had to act before his resolve weakened. I just think that in general stories are usually more interesting when characters actively do things and then deal with the consequences, instead of when characters get pushed around by the plot and other characters. There are exceptions, of course, and passivity is a totally valid character quality, but it depends on how it's done. For example, there's this anime, The Apothecary Diaries, and in that story we see an example where being passive is actually an active character choice. And just in general, The Apothecary Diaries has phenomenal writing, and I would like to talk about that show separately. But going back to One Piece, being passive is not an intentional character quality here. The show made the characters who were very active in the manga seem more passive, which is unfortunate. Another unfortunate thing that was lost in the show is Sanji's inner struggle. In the manga, in the Baratie arc, he saw how hard Zoro fought for his dreams, how hard Luffy fought, even how hard his enemies fought. And Sanji had to confront this idea that he wasn't like these people, that he was wasting his life by staying at Baratie. I also absolutely loved the moment when Luffy confronted him directly, when he argued with Sanji that he wasn't repaying his debt by staying at the restaurant. Luffy has his own similar story where his mentor sacrificed a limb to save him, so Sanji's choices genuinely angered him. In the show, it was just mentioned in passing, which is unfortunate. In the manga, Sanji's decision to join the Straw Hats had real weight, while in the show, it looked like he just argued with Zeph a little bit and then joined the Straw Hats almost out of convenience and having a common interest to go on this impossible quest. And sure, he saw how hard Luffy fought for his crew and for Baratie, but it was very little compared to what we got in the manga. Another small nitpick, I guess, is that in the show, it isn't always clear when something is a devil fruit power and when something is just a technique. For example, when I watched the show, I thought that Kuro ate a devil fruit that made him super fast, and it was only after I read the manga that I found out that it's just a technique that he trained instead. I know it seems like a small thing, but devil fruits are presented like they are supposed to be rare, hard to get, and very valuable, but the show gave an impression as if every single villain of the week has their own devil fruit. The next few points I have aren't exactly bad changes. They are more about the things that had to get cut, and I fully 100% understand why, but I just loved those things in the manga so much that I can't help but find it unfortunate that those things didn't make it into the show. The first thing is Chocho's story. This was kind of like the first side story that the manga had, and it was insanely good. It was also probably the first time that the manga made me cry, if I remember correctly, and this side story about a dog absolutely destroyed me. Even after reading the entire East Blue saga, it's still one of my favorite parts in the story. And like I said, I fully understand why it had to be removed. I even think that it wouldn't have worked in the live action well, and that's why I don't even want to call it a bad change. Another thing in a similar category are the three kids, also known as Usopp's pirates. I'm not even joking, but the moment of Usopp's pirates disbanding was my favorite manga moment so far. If you don't believe me, I literally have this on record in my top 10 video. Once again, I understand that working with child actors is difficult. This story would have taken a lot of time to do properly, but those kids were such a delight to read about, and they also added so much depth to Usopp's character, so it's a shame they had to be cut. And the last example I have is how the show executed the villages and the villagers compared to the manga. In the manga, every village felt like its own separate character. Every village had its own unique story, they had their own troubles and their own goals. They made the world of One Piece feel like this living, breathing thing. The same goes for the villagers and other background characters. In the manga, they weren't just extras in the background like they were in the show. Instead, their little individual stories always tied into the greater themes of One Piece. Once again, I understand that with the live action, you have to streamline the story. You have to cut some things. It would be too overwhelming to have too many characters and too many things happening at the same time, but I just really loved how every new place that we visited was treated in the manga. And that's all I have for the changes that, in my opinion, were either bad or unfortunate but understandable. Now, you might find it a bit surprising that I didn't mention anything about Nami and Kokoyashi Village. I debated putting it with the bad changes, especially when earlier I already literally said that this arc in the show feels like a downgrade compared to the manga. But in the end, I decided to keep it for the last category I came up with, which is messy changes. So, Arlong Park. If you haven't read the manga, if you're a show only, then this arc seems perfectly fine. It's great even. It explores how hard it was for Nami to ask for help, how strong she is, how she didn't lose her kindness even after everything, and it's a story about the tragedy of her character. The problems begin only when you know how this arc plays out in the manga. I know that a lot, and I mean a lot of people hated how the show changed Nojiko and the villagers when they made them unaware of Nami's plan, but I actually kind of disagree and I don't share the same hate. I already spoke about it earlier, how all random villagers and side characters in the show are turned into background extras, and the show only focuses on the main characters and the main stories. So, in that sense, Nojiko and the entire Kokoyashi village didn't get any special treatment. The show told a story that's easier to tell in the live-action format, and it would have been really difficult to adapt this extremely delicate story exactly how it was in the manga, where everyone knew about Nami's plan. I know it's not really a good defense for this change, but I'm just saying that it's understandable. This change also rippled out into some other consequences. For example, in the manga, Nojiko got tattoos to make Nami feel better, but in the show, those tattoos were just there for the sake of keeping the original character design intact. The show still tried to give those tattoos some emotional weight when Nami got the same ones as Nojiko, but in the show it was simply less meaningful than it was in the manga. Another thing is Genzo's character. In the manga, he was like a father figure to Nami. The pinwheel on his hat is something that he put there just to make baby Nami laugh. And the tattoos were also a mix between a pinwheel and a tangerine, or in other words, a mix between Genzo and Belmere. By turning Genzo into a completely background character, all that was lost. What I'm trying to say is that if season 1 had, let's say, 10 episodes, then they could have slowed down and adapted this arc properly, but I also mostly understand why this arc was changed the way that it was, and I don't share the same hatred for those changes as most manga readers seem to, at least from what I gathered in my comments. However, there are a couple of things that even I can't defend. One of them is Belmere's character. In the manga, she was a proper character, while in the show she was just the mother to the girls. She was reduced to a plot device instead of being a full, interesting character. Another thing that I simply can never forgive is cutting the part where Luffy saw Nami's old pen and commented, "This pen has blood on it," before continuing to fight Arlong and destroying the whole room. That was one of the best moments in that arc. Very subtle, yet extremely powerful. But for some reason, the show decided to replace it with a literal shackle and Nami explicitly explaining how Arlong forced her to wear it. The audiences aren't stupid, so certain points shouldn't be dumbed down. Symbols exist because people are fully capable of understanding them. Stories are more interesting when they are not literal and over-explained. So yeah, this one little change genuinely frustrated me. In conclusion, while I think that Nami's arc was a downgrade in the show compared to the manga, I am putting it with the messy changes instead of the bad ones because I believe that those changes were understandable and that without them, I think that adapting this arc may have failed altogether if they tried to keep it accurate to the manga. The second messy change was cutting Don Krieg and Gin from Baratia. I have very mixed feelings about this, and that's why I'm putting it with the messy changes. In my opinion, Don Krieg was the most forgettable villain in East Blue, so I think that replacing him with Arlong was a good choice. Also, Arlong was like the main villain of the whole season, so I think it's good how the show introduced him earlier and even had Luffy fighting him more than once. And even if you look at the season structurally, episode 6 was a 75% mark, and in stories, that's often a low point. That's often a defeat that sets up the joy we can feel when we finally win in the finale. So yeah, overall, I don't miss Don Krieg and his armada. That fight also would have been a pain to film. There was so much fire, so many explosions, so many destroyed set pieces, and Don Krieg as a villain just isn't good enough or interesting enough to justify spending so much money and so much time just to create a visual spectacle. The problem is what that fight meant for people. I already said that removing Sanji's inner conflict was a bad change, but that change was mostly just a natural consequence of removing Don Krieg. Then there's also Gin, a character who was one of the most interesting and complex characters in East Blue, but since he was a part of Don Krieg's armada, all we got in the live action was just a small tiny cameo. Overall, I think that removing Don Krieg did more good than bad for the live action, but I am also very glad that I could read the manga and get all those additional stories. And the last messy change I want to touch upon is how the show included a parallel Marine storyline, while Garp simply wasn't in the manga at this point, other than the cover stories. As a live-action first fan, I loved this plotline. I loved the reveal that Garp is Luffy's grandfather, how he chased our crew, how he taught Kobe, and I also really loved the scene between Garp and Zeph. I think the only low point for this plotline was in Syrup Village, because the Marines really didn't do much there, and Kobe as a character also felt like he didn't grow at all in this specific arc, and he just kept running in circles. But other than that, I really enjoyed the Marine plotline in the show. Now, the reason why I'm putting it with the messy changes is simply the fact that I have no idea how this impacts the future of the story. I don't know how Garp's introduction went in the source material. I don't know what kind of plotline he had there. What if by gaining something in East Blue, we actually lose something in one of the future sagas when Garp was originally supposed to be introduced? Also, it's unclear what role the Marines will play in Season 2, because in Season 1 they had a very clear arc, but that arc is now finished. Garp and Luffy had their confrontation, Kobe and Helmeppo stood up to their superiors, so what's next? It would feel too jarring if the show just sidelines these characters. So my guess is that we will see the Marines chasing Baroque works, and also we will get some kind of training arc for Kobe and Helmeppo, but that just sounds like a much smaller role compared to what we got in Season 1. So yeah, despite the fact that I really loved the storyline in Season 1, I am still putting it with the messy changes because I simply lack knowledge of what consequences this change might have on the overall story. The fourth part of my plan is to talk about my Season 1 rewatch. Many people in the comments recommended that, saying how there were many Easter eggs, especially with the maps in the end credits, so I kind of watched the show the second time specifically with the intention to look for those things. There are obviously some things that I already caught and spoke about in my other videos, so I want to only mention the things that I didn't notice before. and I'll go through them roughly in a chronological order. In episode 1, we see the bounty poster for Gold Roger, but we don't see his bounty. We only get a glimpse that there were a lot of zeros. I elaborated on what it could mean in my video about theories, but it's something that really stands out on the second watch. Next, during the execution scene, a few people in the crowd are highlighted. I obviously recognized Mihawk and Shanks, but for the longest time I couldn't figure out who the blonde kid with the green jacket was supposed to be. Then it finally hit me that maybe I shouldn't just think about season 1 and I should also consider that maybe it's someone we will meet in the future. So now I'm pretty sure that this is supposed to be that guy with 2 cigars we saw in the trailers because the hair really matches. There was also a drawing of Momo the sea cow on the map. I don't remember if it was the end credits or the opening scene of the first episode, but regardless, it was a very fun detail to include. I also noticed how Rue from Shanks' crew was always eating his ridiculous piece of meat just like his character did in the manga. And it's such a silly detail to include, but I think that's one of the reasons why fans love this adaptation so much. It's because they don't shy away from silly things like these. They also referenced the joke about which way is north, and if you've seen my other videos, then you might know that this was one of my favorite jokes in the entire manga. It's so stupid and it still makes me laugh. I also noticed the marine logo on the box where the gum fruit was kept, so Shanks most likely stole that fruit from the Marines. Next, I paid more attention to the wall with the wanted posters. It teased pirates Bellamy and Foxy that we will probably meet in the future, but there was also a poster of Django behind Buggy's poster, so even if he was cut from the live action, it's fun that he at least got referenced in this way. Another fun reference was how Luffy proposed to get into the marine base by grabbing onto a giant bird, which is literally exactly what happened to him in Orange Town. On my first watch, I also missed that Kabaji was in episode 1 too. He was in the bar close to Zoro, which is a great detail because, as we later find out, that Buggy's pirates planned to steal the map themselves. Nami also mentioned the 77th Marine Unit, and from the manga I remember that this was the unit of Pudding, who tried to fight Arlong and failed spectacularly. I also realized that the scene where Zoro picked up the safe and carried it on his back like it was nothing was a direct reference to the time in the manga when he carried the cage with Luffy. And the last thing from episode 1 that I missed on my first watch was that Garp mentioned that he was pursuing Baroque works. In the map in the end credits, it said that the map was created by the orders of Commander-in-Chief Kong, so I am once again assuming that this is a character we will meet in the future. In episode 2 they mentioned Zoro's beauty sleep, which is a very fun reference because in the manga, Zoro was constantly taking naps and missing some important events or even whole side quests, just like he slept through Gaimon's Island. I also didn't notice it until the rewatch that there was Kuro's wanted poster in Morgan's safe. Next is the fact that Moji was in Buggy's tent holding up a sign, and Buggy even asked where was the dancing lion, which is a bit meta because that's exactly what the audience wanted to ask. Where was Richie the lion? Another character that we saw, even if he wasn't named, was Mayor Boodle. And just in general, it's really cool that Even if a character's role is severely reduced in the show, they still find a way to include those fun character designs. Next is Buggy putting Nami into a cage, while in the manga it was Luffy. To be fair, Luffy was also locked up, only instead of a cage it was a tank with water. I just think it's fun how the show took many different elements from the manga but mixed them in a unique way. Another example of that I personally really like is how in the manga our guys came together and tried to save Gin, while in the show it was Zoro instead. Another reference was the pupils of the Sea King. The live action didn't say it, only showed it, but in the manga it was explained how the pupils of the Sea Kings look when they go berserk, and it was also how Arlong's pupils looked at one point. Next thing I noticed was the black flag with world government written on it behind Garp. That logo had 5 connected dots, so I'm very curious, why 5? What do those 5 dots represent? Because there's 4 seas, so it can't be that, unless the 5th dot is supposed to be about land. It's hard to speculate because at this point I know close to nothing about the world government except the fact that they seem very shady. 5 could also mean the number of people in power, but are they dictators who took power by force? Or maybe they are royalty? At this point, anything is possible, and there's also a possibility that I'm just overthinking those 5 dots, but hey, theorizing is the most fun part about doing this whole thing. But let's move on. I also saw a dog in the crowd, but to be fair, it was people in the comments who told me that there was a dog in the crowd who was supposed to represent Chocho. And in the end credits, I also saw the island of rare animals, which is Gaimon's Island, and also Kumata Islands, which refers to the Kumata tribe that we saw in Buggy's cover story. The intro logo for episode 3 had Usopp's hammer, and it made me very happy because for some weird reason I just really love Usopp with a hammer. Another thing in episode 3 that was very fun to notice was the fact that we didn't see Buggy's right ear in any of the shots where he was present. The team made sure to hide it because that ear was supposed to be with our crew listening in, and I know it seems obvious, like, yeah, of course they hid it. But I feel like many productions just wouldn't have bothered and would have filmed the actor exclusively from his left side to avoid showing that the right ear was gone. Next is episode 4, where I finally noticed that the name of the village where Zoro trained was the same as the name of Kuina's family. I elaborated on that in my theories video if you are interested. But the coolest catch in episode 4 was actually the song that they played at the end. If you don't know, I actually watched a few anime episodes too that were recommended to me in the comments. So I recognized that the live action used the opening song We Are from the anime. I know that I'm a new fan, but I bet that for older fans, this must have felt like such a treat that would hit right in the feels. Next is the fact that the logo in episode 5 was Zeph's flag from the manga. His Jolly Roger was the funniest that I've seen so far, and when I watched the show for the first time, I could have never guessed that that absurd chicken was Zeph's pirate flag. Episode 5 also showed Full Body, only they didn't name him, and this episode also once again referenced the 77th Marine Unit. We also saw Luffy break some plates in the restaurant. In the manga he broke all of them, but it's still fun how the show included that he broke at least a few. Episode 6 logo included Sanji's eyebrow that isn't a part of his character design in the live action, and it also included Patty's heart. There was also another kind of meta joke when Arlong saw Luffy and said, "I was expecting someone bigger," and Luffy replied, "So was I." Fishmen, including Arlong, are huge in the manga. They tower over everyone. So this sounds like a small joke that the manga fans must have also expected someone bigger. Episode 7 mentioned Goza Village, and we saw how it was destroyed in the manga, but that's the only thing I caught in episode 7. And episode 8 referenced many fight moves names from the manga, but this point kind of applies to the whole season. There were just more examples in the final episode. Another thing that applies to the whole season is that I noticed that all sets were very elaborate and full. For example, there were a lot of paintings in Baratia, so I wouldn't be surprised if many things in these sets throughout the entire season hid references for the fans who are caught up with the manga and would recognize them. And that's all the references I managed to notice on my second watch through. I bet I only noticed a fraction of what the creators actually put in the show, but this video is already ungodly long, so it'll do. Let's move on to the final part of my video, finally, which is just a bunch of random stuff that I couldn't fit anywhere else. First, I watched a few behind-the-scenes videos, and yeah, they made me appreciate the show even more. First, the sets were mostly physical. The team literally built all the ships, like Going Merry or Alvida's ship, or even the Baratia. The same goes for Buggy Stand, Kaya's mansion, and all other sets. It's no wonder that Season 1 looked so great, because we weren't looking at a volume room or a green screen that could extend smaller sets. No, we were looking at literal physical, fully built sets that the actors could freely interact with. The same with using prosthetics, like they did with the Fishmen, instead of using CGI on everything. Sure, special effects can do a lot, and sometimes there's no choice but to use it if you want your show to look good. But whenever it's possible, then nothing beats well-made physical sets, prosthetics, and props. The same applies to lighting. I am not an expert, obviously, but it looks like One Piece used a lot of physical lighting setups, maybe even natural sunlight, instead of relying on post-production. I feel like nowadays a lot of shows and films are allergic to shadows. They all look like they were shot in an evenly lit, sterile hospital room, but I didn't notice that with One Piece at all, and everything just looked really natural. Another video one of you recommended was where Buggy's actor showed a few departments, like costume, makeup, and props department, and once again, the scale of everything and the attention to detail was truly impressive. I think they said they had like 1,000 individual people's worth of wardrobe, and those aren't just random street clothes. The costumes for One Piece must have been mostly custom made or at least modified to look like in the manga or in the cover art. Honestly, I'm a bit jealous. When I look at One Piece behind the scenes, I get this urge to work on some kind of project like that myself, especially something where you can create custom props or custom costumes. Other than a few small crafts like knitting a hat, I haven't built anything significant with my own hands for at least a few years now, so I really admire watching stuff like this. I feel like creating something, especially when it's something physical that you can touch, is just so fulfilling. But before I go completely off topic, let's move on to the stunts. The action in the show looked great. And one of the main reasons for that is because the actors can actually fight. Makenyu, who plays Zoro, is an actual swordsman. Taz, who plays Sanji, learned to fight and cook too, by the way. Emily, who plays Nami, also used to do karate, and other actors also do most of their own stunts. And it seriously makes all the difference in the world. In action scenes, the One Piece show has an actual proper fight choreography, which definitely stands out when most action films and action scenes nowadays just hide behind a billion cuts every single second, and it's genuinely unwatchable. But with One Piece, the fights had flow. They had this beautiful motion that you didn't have to hide behind a billion cuts because the actors could actually pull off that beautiful choreography. And the last detail I have about the visuals is that it was very cool how in some shots the show recreated panels one-to-one, like Kid Sanji sitting on a cliff with his bag of food and looking at the moon, or how the boys were posing before going to fight Arlong. But now let's move on to a few other things. Some of you asked me in the comments if I will continue reading the manga, and I mean, of course I will. I know that season 3 is already in production, so the wait after season 2 won't be that long. So after season 2, I'll only read the content that was already covered in that season, and then I will take another break. After season 3, however, I don't know. I genuinely like doing things this way, where I watch the show first with no pre-existing expectations or notions about how that season should go, and then I get all the additional context from the source material. But I also know how hard it can be to be patient. I think it depends on how season 3 ends, and then I'll decide. But for season 2, you can expect me to do manga reviews the same way as I did with the season 1 content. I know that eventually, regardless of how the live action goes, I will catch up with the manga fully, and it's a question of when, not if. Many people also ask me about the anime, but I'm sorry, but I won't watch it other than checking out a few episodes here and there. At the end of the day, anime is also just an adaptation, so I prefer reading the manga and watching the live action. I also heard that the pacing in One Piece anime gets atrocious as the time goes on, and I already had my fill of atrocious pacing when I watched Naruto a few years ago. So I am sorry, but I'll only stick to the manga and the live action, and also the new anime remake that they keep promising at some point. I've also seen someone ask if I follow the promo clips from the show, and the answer is no. I've only seen the main trailers on YouTube and also a few other YouTube videos, mostly stuff that was recommended in the comments. I would love to also watch some interviews with the cast, but the problem is that when we are talking about adaptations and not original shows, actors pretty often just casually reference things in the source material, and I prefer to go into stuff completely blindly. I mean, even with the first season of One Piece, I didn't even watch the trailer, I didn't read the summary, and all I knew was the name of the main character and that this was a story about pirates. I usually don't watch trailers for first seasons of any show, and I usually only watch them for any following seasons, but even then, not always. I discovered some of the best shows precisely this way, and it's such a great feeling when you know nothing, you expect nothing, and then you end up falling in love with that story. There was one very fun question in the comments. I'll just read it. Apart from dinosaurs and giant sea creatures, I would like you to guess what other fantastical elements One Piece might have in the future. And the comment also specified to do just a guessing game and nothing serious. The first thing that came to my mind is Greek mythology, and especially the wind god Aeolus. So this wind god Aeolus lives on this island, and technically in the original myth it's supposed to be a regular island, but in many versions of that myth, and also in many modern retellings, that island is portrayed as a floating island in the sky, and I feel like something like that could really fit into the One Piece universe. We already have water that defies physics and goes uphill, so why not have a floating island? And just in general, I feel like many things from Greek mythology or from other mythologies around the world could fit into One Piece. In Season 1, Zeph already mentioned wrestling with a giant boar, which is, surprise surprise, a story from the Greek mythology. I could also imagine One Piece doing a spin on the world tree from Norse mythology, like this tree that connects different places and is guarded by a dragon or a giant squirrel or something like that. Also, sirens. We are literally sailing the seas, so we have to get sirens. Other than things from different mythologies, I actually really struggled to come up with anything else. I mean, I never could have guessed that we would get dinosaurs, so I feel like at this point anything is possible. One thing I can imagine getting is ghosts. It would be very funny if a ghost joined the Straw Hats. I just imagine Luffy constantly eating and his ghost friend looking on with jealousy because every time they try to grab a piece of food, their fingers just phase through it. Maybe the ghost could be our musician, but instead of singing sea shanties, they could sing some morbid tunes and constantly interrupt Zoro's beauty sleeps. You know, you said I should do a guessing game, and I think that this is funny. And while I'm on the topic of ghosts, another thing I could imagine is a devil fruit that can bring someone back to life. Something like an immortality fruit. The live fruit. I'm sorry, my mind is kind of scrambled at this point. You know what? Let's just get to the last part I have, which is a little bonus content that I personally find pretty cool. When I first started this channel, I didn't want to show my face, which is pretty funny considering that here I am half a year later. But the point is that if you've been following me, then you know that when I did my manga reviews, I kept redrawing different One Piece manga panels in the background. I started doing that purely because I needed to put something in the background while I talked that's not copyrighted material. I didn't have a specific goal or an end result. I just kept drawing a few panels every week, and you know what? I ended up with a pretty impressive pile of sketches. I counted them and I redrew 60 panels. If someone before all this told me to redraw 60 panels from One Piece, I would have told them, "What? That's so much work." But when action came before thought, I didn't even notice the drawings slowly piling up. There's this advice: think before you act. And 95% of the time, I agree with it. Like, it's not even an advice, it's just the only acceptable course of action. But, sometimes not doing that can save people from overthinking. If something feels too overwhelming, then just don't think. Just start doing something. And it's not just about the drawings, it also applies to my channel. I always admired people who created and shared videos talking about the things they love. But I always had this idea in my head that this is just not for me. Then I realized that I was being stupid and I should just try it instead of thinking. I created a new YouTube account before even Googling what software I could use to edit my videos. I was improvising in the beginning and I am still improvising now, but recently, thanks to you, I just hit 1000 subscribers, which is just crazy. I am now a proper small YouTuber. This is so cool. So thank you if you support me, and thank you if you are still here, because this video is ungodly long. So it's time for me to stop yapping. Thank you for listening and goodbye.